My name is Irvin Shaifa, um, and I am based out in LA. I am a architectural designer currently at Rios. I am also a writer. I enjoy writing about architectural theory, poems, and just about life. And I also enjoy making music. I make a lot of beats, and yeah, I like to dabble a lot because of the city I'm in. Music, writing, architecture, I'd say they're all just forms of, creation or art in a sense. And what made me really get into doing all that stuff was essentially architecture. So architecture always came first, and then the architecture is what got me into music and actually got me into writing and got me into any other art form. It's a Architecture is it's a discipline that, unlike other art forms, you're not born with. You're not born a great. You can be born a great singer, and you can have adequate writing capabilities, maybe, but there are some art forms that people tend to be naturals at, I'd say. And with architecture, it was never the case. If anything, if you were a natural, then you weren't meant to be in architecture because you were always taught to unteach yourself. And so I'd say that really got me into architecture. And then as I got into architecture, it's a discipline that likes to pull from the world. And as you learn more about the world, you also want to participate in it. And so that's what got me into just trying to do everything that I can do or possibly can learn and do. So I'd say architecture was a great means of learning. I think you'll hear a lot of stories about Legos and things like that. And, do you know what you're getting into before you commit to such a practice like this? I'd say I was rather lucky because I'm 25, so I am essentially of the internet. And as a young person, or even younger than what I am currently, the internet was our sort of place to exist. And I remember one day I just stumbled upon, I think it was Lebbeus Wood's Arcadia series. And I was living in a slummy part of Trenton, New Jersey, and I realized that I wanted to create the world and all over again, or not again necessarily, but have a fresh start. And I want to recreate the world because I didn't like how the world looked at the time. And so that was my point of reference. And then getting into architecture school, and that's all disrupted, of course. It was like I was chasing someone that never knew I existed. Rest in peace, of course. But as I was learning, I stopped emulating things and I started just trying. And architecture school, my academic experience was a lot of like unlearning about what I thought was right, and going through that process is a process of self-realization in reality. And I think everyone comes out of architecture school as different versions of themselves, and so I guess my version of myself is was something that was very aggressive throughout architecture school, I'd say, and a spirit that I found through architecture school because I was always creating. And when you're always the one producing something rather than consuming something, there's a moment in time where you have to sort of look back and think about you, the producer, and what capacity can you even do that. The most simplest answer would be my place of origin is where I was born, because it's essentially the beginning of everything for depending on who you are. And so I was born in a small town not too far away from the Monrovia, which is in Liberia, which is geographically speaking, which is in West Africa. And I think one thing that's always been consistent in all the places I've moved throughout my life, and the place of origin I've always felt to be more like me, was always the sky above me. And so I think that's another reason why I moved to LA, if I really think about it, was because of how vast the sky felt. And it's something we tend to take for granted. I left Africa as a little kid. I was born, I'd say, at the tail end of a civil war. And so I grew up mostly in multiple cities throughout the United States, Houston, Trenton, Louisville, Kentucky. And when I tell anyone about what I think of any of those places, especially LA, I tend to always talk about the sky and how I felt about the seasons and how I felt about the atmosphere, the colors, and the density of those places. And because those are all conversations that are, some would say, historic, or, there's a history to it, of course. Why are buildings this far away from each other? Why are they this close from each other? Why are buildings this tall? Why can't I see the sky today? And so when I talk about the places that I enjoyed and the places that I enjoy living, like LA, for example, I find myself talking about how an atmosphere that a city can produce. And for LA, I'd say it's very vast. It feels endless in the most calming way that I can possibly think of right now. My work is very much influenced by, I take in a lot, as much as I really can. And so I'm influenced by a lot of people a lot. Like, I'm influenced by everyday things as well. When it comes to people, I mentioned sort of Levius Woods as the person I chase in terms of like mastery of this discipline. My mentors were always the people that were rooting for me. Sort of Martin Summers, he worked in Morphosis, so now he's a sort of professor at the University of Kentucky, which is where I went. I think of sort of Dwayne Orler and Jenny Wu. They gave me my first shot at an internship, which made me want to stay in LA. And so when I think about my mentors, even the ones that I've never met that are kind of like my mentors, I think of Muhammad Ali, the boxer, Allen Iverson, the basketball player. I take from a lot of things from the culture, because at the end of the day, I am of the culture. I am a spawn of that, and especially if I'm from a generation that is very provocative when it comes to how we view culture and how we produce it. And so because of that, I find inspiration in not just my mentors, but in things that others would consider inanimate. And so when I do architectural drawings, I tend to find myself looking at cereal boxes, IKEA, pamphlets, and anime, rather than, point of reference from like an OMA diagram, which those diagrams are great, right? But those aren't the point of reference that I grew up on. I grew up on like hip hop music and CDs and internet, and just that all together produces its own aesthetic, I'd say, that I'm just a regurgitation of. And then I just sort of use architecture as my tool to bring some of that in. So my mentors have always encouraged that, and my mentors and their work have always done that for their generation or in their points of views. And so when I think about the people I looked up to growing up, and the people I said that have helped me get to where I am today, they were always referencing from life itself. And I think that's really important. I think it's always been around. I just think we're lucky enough where it's curated and created at a capacity that allows us to have a more diverse set of references. But when you think of modernism, what they are referencing, like, of course, it is sort of, there is a self-production in modernism, right? And that productive value maybe sort of has inspiration from boats and a lot of the technologies that were coming out at the time, aerodynamics, the idea of functionalism and all the tech that was coming out during modernism, all the machinery that was inspiring Corb and the rest of sort of modernist architects. And then you have the aesthetic, and how maybe machinery can be aestheticized, that which goes further when you think of like Wes Jones and maybe like an earlier version of Neil Denari, or maybe some would argue not, but you can think of postmodernism and sort of its references to, I'd say, hyper-capitalism, or maybe not even the word hyper in front of capitalism, because at the end of the day, capitalism is just hyper. And so I'd say that everything seems to always be a response. Architecture unknowingly always responds to life and what's happening at the moment. And I'd rather say we're lucky because we seem to have so much going on with life, and we can curate the life that's going on. We can look into any part of the world because we can go online and type in something.com. All the ideas you had in school they're referenced off of like education, academia. But when you're done with that, your references are now based off of sort of adulthood and the life that entails. And so when you finish school and you're now practicing, you're learning from the practice, but then you're also using school as a reference for what you, or in your sort of path in school as a reference for what you consider the position you want to be in the future when you do architecture or further your practice. And so it's a very weird spot actually, because as they say, it's an old man's sort of practice, because you just want to grow, you just want to get older so that you can get your license and just do it yourself. And so where I'm at is I'm restless, if anything, because I look forward to learning more and taking in more. And so I'd say it's an interesting limbo spot to be in, but it's also great because you're young at the same time. So I think there's a lot of hype and a lot of sort of thought that's been put into this, and it's interesting because I've heard friends talk about the same thing, and they'll be like, "Oh, I'm licensed in my country." I have friends from India who can already sign off on drawings and whatnot, and it's, when I compare it to America, I'd say that the term "you need more experience" is actually, it's honestly false, because in reality, everyone has a lot of people have experiences and so just if I were born in India and I went through that education system, they would have given me the experiences and the knowledge in order to create buildings. And so I think the main proponent that makes this hard for a young student in America is honestly the culture of architecture that's brewed here for the past several or many decades. And it's a culture here that I feel like it's up to people my age to change, because it is quite ridiculous if you really think about it, because someone who has done architecture for 5 years would you be able to tell the difference between, in terms of like understanding the basics of like making a building? If you've done architecture for 5 years and if you've done it for 15 years, we think that there's a huge gap there. But in reality, your first building is where you really learn everything. And after that, you're just challenging yourself to learn more. So the only difference between the 5-year architect and the 15-year architect is that the 15-year architect is learning more stuff and trying to push the boundaries. But if we're talking about a basis of how to make a building and how to make it function, experience is something that is nice to have if you're from those other countries where they hand that to you, or of course you earn it, and you get your degree and then you go get licensed and you can stamp drawings. I think that's really helpful. And I think that in America, there's a culture around architecture and about just the term, the architect, the way that how heavy that word is in America. It creates this hierarchy. It creates this bureaucracy, and that doesn't really exist. So I'm actually in the camp that agrees with the idea that we should be able to get licensed after this or take our test, as long as the school systems, of course, as long as the academic world was actually meant for that. But at the same time, perhaps the academic world isn't responsible for that. Maybe it's not up to the schools. Maybe the schools shouldn't do that. Maybe things would American architecture students create the work that they currently make at that capacity if you put in, sort of actually making buildings into the curriculum at the capacity of other countries. Would it be the same? I'm not too sure. But what I do know, I'd say, is that there should be a clearer process. I'd love to see that, where maybe it's not necessarily taught in school, but there's mentorships, and there's back in the day, before there was the architectural degree, there was how would you call it, apprenticeships, and we've sort of masked that now, where we've said we've masked that term and we've sort of said internships. And I think that's where the problem is because the internship is no longer no longer has the qualities that the apprenticeship had. The apprenticeship was learning under the architectural master, and so you did school, you learned under the master, and then you yourself became a proficient architect that would eventually be a master afterwards. And then anything that has to do with like people wanting you to get their building done, they wouldn't trust you because they would just reference back to your apprenticeship. But right now we're kind of in a really muddy area where we have the internship. So everyone's getting underpaid and whatnot to sort of do all these tasks and things that don't necessarily help as much in terms of building the building, but help a lot with maybe visualizing the building or getting everything out for the client to understand the building, but not actually building the building. And so internships have sort of lost that way. So I'd say that maybe it's not up to the schools, but I think that the process of apprenticeship or schools giving you the year or the space while you're in school to really learn under a specific architect would be really helpful. So that's something that I think in my head that would help with that, because I feel like when I look at other countries and other students in architecture school, what they have is maybe not always an apprenticeship, but there always seems to be a system, a very clear system that is equivalent to everyone. And because of that system, you're going to get your license because you went through the system. And if you didn't go through the system, then you failed, right? And then you can go do something else, because of course this practice is not for everyone. SARC was a beautiful place to attend school, and I really loved my time in terms of doing architecture. It's a school that really does architecture. It's not just plans and sections elevations, but you're really participating in the discipline. At the same time, I don't think any school should really teach you how to be an architect in that sense, because at the end of the day, architecture is a tool, and then you are the architect, right? And so I feel like the importance of school is to really allow you to refine your tools and to polish them and to gather more and to understand how they can be used. But when it comes to learning how to be an architect, that will always be up to you at the end of the day. No amount of you can read all the theory you want, you can make all the buildings you want, but deciding and learning what an architect is will always be up to you. Because if it was so consistent flat across the board, then we would all be making the same building and we'd all be serving the same types of people. When you do an undergrad somewhere else, you get a very you understand what traditionalism looks like in terms of your education. And so when a school like SciArc starts reeling you in because of its lack of tradition, it's very special. It's very special. And so, but I will also say I envy the people that go into SciArc not knowing what they're going to get into. I think that's also very special. My days are very calm. I do a lot of writing, and I work a lot. I work a lot of hours to meet my deadlines and just sort of make sure the projects I'm helping out with really get to a place that I feel proud of. And so I watch a lot of TV, and I found that it's actually my friend was here not too long ago. He loves film, and now I'm starting to watch more TV and more movies because I'm starting to understand how Hollywood views frames and perspectives, and it's honestly fascinating. I wish that was taught more in architecture school because not just for the idea of visualizing something, but the idea that the perspective of a person is actually way more complex than we think. Of just putting them at 5'10" isn't enough. Putting the camera at 5'10" is not enough. Yeah, it's there's more to it when we talk about the perspective of someone. And so I'd say my day has to do a lot about just consuming as much as I can, because my day is spent a lot creating for my firm, or for the office that I'm in, and I think a lot of times we get so into creating things that we're forgetting that we're also consumers, and consuming is not a bad thing, because if you allow the cycle to do what it does for a natural creative, then as you consume, your reference evolves and you create better things. And so others would say take away the word consuming and put the word learning, but either way, tomato, taking in as much as I can every day is what I typically do with my day. And so when I can't do that, I always have a bad day. So I think mental health, relaxing, is really important. And that's something I know SciArc likes to put out, not SciArc, I'd say architectural schools love to put out this idea of the overnight, studio person that's working super hard and they're doing this. And I'll be honest with you, I got a lot of sleep throughout architecture school. And I was very proficient, and I always was on time for my pinups. And it wasn't because architecture school was easy. I just thought that in order for me to create, I had to be in a good space mentally. And so I keep it consistent. And it's actually easier than ever, because honestly, if you were to compare the practice in terms of deadlines and stuff to architecture school, I'd say architecture school is harder. Before I started doing the stuff I was doing like a sketchbook every semester called the SciArc series. I have them on my little thing, and they're usually, I was just drawing after a project was done. I think a lot of times people will always ask me, how do you draw? How do you make what you make? And digitally or physically. And in reality, we have to learn how to always reflect on what we do. And a lot of times after a huge review or something, you kind of just go to sleep and have a drink of your buds and call it a day, and then you go to the next semester. But in reality, it's actually really good to draw your project again and again and again, because and redraw it and recreate the building in a way and through drawing, because architecture comes in many different facets, not just the building. And so if you do the drawing and you start figuring something out through elevation, then change the elevation, and then you can change the plans. Or it's always reflecting, and it's not something you're trying to perfect. Rather, these are sketches, these are digital sketches, these are whatever you want it to be. And so I think a lot of my work, and the way I do it, has always been about thinking about something that is both future, present, and past. And so when I try to draw, I draw in that limbo that says that the art, the building, the drawing, and the representation or the ideas are all just playing within this field, in this space. And so with the work that I do currently, I'm very much into the idea of the limbo. For me, the limbo is classified as the in-between space of architecture. The drawing and the building are two very set things that we like to always talk about as different things that do different tasks. I'm interested in that. I'm interested in that gray area. The digital and the physical have always been seen as two different things. One will always tell the other, and if there is a sort of, it's always like your turn or my turn. I'm interested in the middle. When we use multiple softwares to create one image, that is what I'm interested in. I'm interested in the limbo. I'm interested in the cluster of something, that gray area. And so I've been doing a lot of workshops in the past year, sort of teaching students, different softwares, to sort of create different images and animations, because both now and also for architecture, we like to think we're very stagnant practice when it comes to how we understand objects. So like a building is not moving, right? And so or it's not alive. I don't know. Depends on your theories. So no one come at me. But what I'm trying to essentially get at is buildings don't get up and just walk away from you. So they tend to be very stagnant. And your drawings are very stagnant. And then what we do when we represent the drawings is that we create animations sometimes. And so we show how we walk the building. And so I've always been interested lately into a drawing and an animation. Why are those two things considered different? And so when I do a lot of drawings back in my undergrad and my graduate, I was always thinking about how my drawings were moving, how the eyes were moving across a space. And so animations do that. And so it's not about the animation or the drawing, it's about viewing both as the same thing. And so even if you're not making an animation or you're not making a drawing, they both deliberately have movement, passion, and aggressiveness in it. And then I guess the last thing the last two things I've been interested in lately is, or I guess the last thing is just, I'm always like thinking about so many things that never have to do with, well, not never have to do with anything, but like I tend to always speculate a lot. And that's another reason why I'm always pushing architecture students to relax, because when you relax, you can speculate more. But I've been interested in the idea of the submerged landscape. And so I talked to you earlier about the limbo, right? The in-between. So I'm actually really interested in the idea of the limbo in the urban fabric. And so right now, as you look, I have this monstera plant. It's, very long, very large plant too. Like, I've had this for a year, and, you can plant it outside and that's your landscape. And then this is the building, this is the architecture. And firms will set that up. They'll say, that's the landscape architecture, the landscape, and then this is the architecture. And so I'm interested in the limbo. I'm interested in the submerged landscape, that a building and multiple buildings are just landscapes. This building is no different than the landscape than the palm trees that are outside of this house. And so the submerged landscape, I guess, goes back to my ideas that I thought about as a kid when I was looking at Lebbeus Wood's Arcadia drawings. I was lucky enough during the pandemic to teach a few workshops I taught a workshop at University of Kentucky where I got my bachelor's before SciArc. Then I taught another workshop at Carnegie Mellon and Kent State. And so those are opportunities given to me by either students there or by people that I looked up to, mentors and teachers and whatnot, professors and instructors. And it was great. It helped me through the pandemic because, it's rather boring, internalized thing. And so I was teaching students or I wouldn't say teaching, because maybe I was teaching. It's up to them if they think I was teaching. So I'm just going to say I was sharing them the ideas that I'd been working on at the time, and teaching them how to do those sort of different things with like different softwares and how to sort of create these drawings that I was speculating with at the time. Then afterwards, I realized that it felt like exclusive. It was starting to get exclusive. Essentially, I was sharing the work of other students, and people were contacting me saying, "When can I learn?" And so I said, "Well, let's just do a workshop, a completely free workshop." And that was a great decision because we had like 50 people one week just sitting in their rooms on a Saturday, willing to hear me talk about and teach them any software that they had wanted at the time to learn. And I thought that was really special. And I'm doing another series of that in the fall after I wrap up my website. But I think teaching is really important. I don't think it's for everyone, but I do think that if you have it and if you're passionate about it, you definitely do it, because we need more people passionate in this practice, not just about architecture, but about people. And so I say that I'm very passionate about sharing my ideas to people and learning from them and collaborating with them. But I'd say it's not right now, though. I'd say that my main focus is to be an architect and to, in the purest sense, destroy the world and create the world at the same time. I know that sounds rather aggressive, but I guess that's who I am, aggressive. And so I'd say that when that process happens and I finally reach a point where I feel like I'm good, I'll probably start teaching in the future and share any radical ideas I can possibly think of, because that's a calling that every architect has, is to share their ideas. I think that type of sharing is extremely important. Imagine if you didn't share, you would be good, but you would be good temporarily, because at the end of the day, you'd be holding everything in and you wouldn't be learning anything. You would just be trying your best to take, but you wouldn't necessarily have applied it anywhere. And so what sharing allows you to do is to give as much as you can because it's for two reasons. Sharing is important, actually. It's important because it's a good thing to do. It's the right thing to do. And when you share and you let it all out, that challenges you to then go and get more, to then share, and then go and get more, and then share. And eventually the mind of the 15-year-old architect, the architect that's been practicing for that long, that's the difference between a 15-year-old architect and a 5-year-old architect, is that the one that's been practicing for 15 years has essentially been sharing, because they're sharing their ideas to the client, they're sharing their buildings to the world, and they're sharing their practice to everyone that collaborates with them. And so, segueing to that second thing, sharing is important because at the end of the day, it's the building blocks of our practice. I think this one's more personal for me. So I'll tell you, in terms of architecture, I absolutely adore and love making forms. I love making architecture. I love the shapes and forms of something, the dynamism or stillness that every object holds. And my mentor once told me, Martin Summers, actually, he had explained to me, he told me, you think very fragmented. You're a fragmented thinker. And I was about to graduate from undergrad. And when he told me that, I was like, holy crap, I'm not ready to go to grad school. It stuck for me, and it stuck forever, actually. He should have explained it. He said, there are those that think very fragmented. And then he then said that there's the other side. I didn't know what that other side was. But he said, he gave me an example of architects that think very fragmented and make very fragmented work. Fragment as in thinking of things as components. So naturally, there are two types of, and I'll tell you now what the other side is. The side that I've not categorized is the continuous side, right? And so those that are fragmented thinkers, right, you tend to think of architecture as a series of components. Now, buildings are always going to be a series of components, but you go the extra mile to sort of let that be the base of making something. It's like a puzzle. You put things together, and you emphasize that they're fragments. You're sort of in a sense, a very deconstructed thinker. Those that think very continuous are the opposite. They think about the overall form of the building. They think about the silhouette, the overall gesture, and the capacity that it sort of exists in. It's not necessarily about seams and seamlessness, but it's more about how it's seen and how it functions. So the idea that it's of one thing, of one idea, and fragmented is multiple. And so it's a scale. And architects can do both. We learn both. And we were taught different isms, different architectural styles that had associated themselves along that scale. And it was a hard pill to swallow for him to tell me I thought very fragmented and that I couldn't control it. That was very hard for me. But it was also the answer on why I couldn't create the stuff I wanted to create in a very refined way. Because every master architect eventually must master this scale, must understand when things are in components and when things are one. The scale of the buildings they're making, each individual piece, the details that they make it at, it's all within this scale. And so when I went to SciArc, I challenged myself. I said, I'm not going to be too crazy. I'm not going to be too aggressive. I was a very fragmented thinker, and some would say that's a very aggressive way of looking at architecture too. You know, you're just smashing and gliding, and I told myself that when I went to SciArc, that I would refine myself a bit. I would purposely learn the other scale. I would purposely, while everyone else in architecture, and not architecture, but while everyone else in SciArc was actually doing the fragmented stuff and doing the crazy stuff and doing all these, forms that you've seen SciArc do, I was trying to refine myself. Every time I wanted to make something large and big and striking, I would tone it down a little bit. I would refine it. I'd give it even a fillet sometimes, just to make sure that there was a smoothness, there was something to it that was easy. Not easy as in terms of easy to do, but easy on the eyes, not too aggressive. Basically the hardest thing for me was to control my emotions when making architecture. And so when I figured that out, then I learned how to go back to what I was and also bring with me my new tools and my new ways of making to create what some would consider their voice. And so, but this voice is not finalized, of course. My thesis was a sort of taste of it, but it's an ongoing process. And I feel like I've gotten closer, a step closer. So yeah, the hardest thing to do while I was in architecture school was to essentially control my own aspirations for building and drawings, and to, instead of trying to create things that were so striking and so whatever, refine them and still accomplish that, but just perfect them. And it's not about how much work you have. It's not about how much work you pin up. It's about what each and every drawing did. And so as I went through architecture school, when an instructor asked for 14 drawings, I said, I'll take the B. I'm going to pin up 3 drawings and see what I can do with only 3 drawings to explain a building. I guess the hardest thing in the future is going to be taking your imagination and manifesting it. It's the hardest thing for a lot of architects, because things aren't so smooth in the physical world like it is in the digital world or on the pen and paper. You never consider the client when you're making your museum back when you were in architecture school. You can, maybe some square footage, but you never took into account the fact that the client doesn't like the color red. You never took into account that the client didn't want it to come so aggressive. You never took into account the client was trying to sell this portion of the building to future tenants. So that's why I said more architects should rest themselves and consume from the world and understand people, because it'll make it easier. And after the building's done, it doesn't even belong to you. And so the hardest thing in the future is always to make a building. It always will be. But if you want to make it easier on yourself, try to be a people person. Try to love people and see what it means to serve people and serve society and cultures.